My husband spent 6 years telling me his ex was better, so I divorced him, and she rejected him too. My name is Natalie Carter. I'm 34 years old, and until 3 weeks ago, I honestly believed patience could fix almost anything. I had been married to my husband, Ethan Brooks, for 6 years, and we'd been together for 8. We never had children, and lately I've caught myself thinking that was probably the smartest decision we ever made. Looking back, our marriage didn't fall apart because of one explosive fight. It slowly eroded under the weight of endless comparisons. Somehow, even the smallest disagreements ended with Ethan reminding me I wasn't the woman he really wanted. In his mind, there was always someone who would have handled things better. The woman Ethan always believed would have handled everything better was his ex-girlfriend, Olivia. They had dated for 2 years before she moved across the country for work, and according to Ethan, the breakup had been mutual. He always described it as ancient history, insisting they'd simply wanted different futures. But ancient history has a funny way of refusing to stay buried. In our marriage, it showed up at dinner, in the grocery store, during family gatherings, and in almost every argument we ever had. If I forgot to pick up his dry cleaning after work, he'd shrug and say, "My ex never forgot things like that." If I came home with the wrong cereal, he'd laugh and tell me she always knew exactly which one I liked. When I wasn't thrilled about driving 3 hours to his cousin's third wedding in 18 months, he'd remind me, "My ex loved spending time with my family. She never acted like it was an obligation." Even when I earned a promotion, he found a way to diminish it. Olivia was already managing an entire department before she turned 30. Eventually, I realized none of my accomplishments mattered. No matter what I did, there was always someone smarter, more thoughtful, more ambitious, or somehow more deserving standing between us. The hardest part wasn't competing with another woman. It was competing with the perfect version of her Ethan had rebuilt inside his own memories. At first, I convinced myself I simply needed to try harder. I started reorganizing my life around his preferences. My phone filled with reminders. I memorized birthdays I'd never cared about, learned recipes he'd mentioned years earlier, and even drove across town for a particular brand of coffee because Olivia used to buy it for him. I honestly believed that if I loved him well enough, he'd eventually stop looking backward. Instead, the comparisons became even more frequent. Whenever I admitted they hurt, he'd let out a tired sigh, as though I was the one creating the problem. He always gave me the same tired response. "Oh, Natalie, I don't want her. I'm just making conversation. You take everything too personally." After hearing those same excuses for years, I stopped arguing. Not because the comments stopped hurting, but because I already knew how every conversation would end, with me apologizing for being too sensitive. 8 months before everything finally collapsed, Ethan spent nearly 20 minutes explaining why Olivia had always understood his career ambitions better than I did. That night, after he went to bed, I quietly scheduled a consultation with a divorce attorney. I never mentioned it to anyone, not even my sister. Sitting in that attorney's office felt strangely surreal. I listed years of comparisons out loud, half expecting him to think I was overreacting. Instead, he listened without interrupting, never laughed, never minimized what I'd experienced, and simply handed me his business card. "When you're ready," he said. At the time, I wasn't, or at least that's what I kept telling myself. Everything changed last Tuesday. I got home before Ethan and decided to make homemade pasta. It wasn't anything fancy, just fresh sauce, garlic bread, and a recipe I'd cooked dozens of times over the years. It used to be one of his favorites. He walked through the door, loosened his tie, kissed my forehead without really looking at me, and immediately picked up his phone before sitting down. I served dinner, and for the first few minutes neither of us said much. Then he took a bite, frowned slightly, and set his fork down. "This is kind of bland." I looked at him. "I followed the same recipe." "Maybe." He barely glanced up from his screen before adding, "You know, Olivia made incredible bolognese. Hers tasted like something you'd get at a really good Italian restaurant." My shoulders tightened. He kept scrolling. "She just understood the seasoning better." Still staring at his phone, he added one more sentence. "I never had to explain what flavors I liked." I sat there watching him while the food I'd spent an hour cooking slowly went cold. He hadn't thanked me. He hadn't even looked me in the eye. Then he started another sentence. "My ex would have..." He never got to finish it. Something inside me finally broke. There was no shouting or dramatic outburst. I simply realized I'd reached the point where nothing he said could make me stay. It felt like an old floorboard finally giving way after years of carrying too much weight. I set my fork beside my plate and looked at him. "Ethan." He glanced up from his phone, distracted. "Yeah? Then maybe you married the wrong woman." The words seemed to knock the air out of him. "What?" "You heard me." He stared as if he couldn't decide whether I'd actually said it or he'd imagined it. I didn't mean..." "No." I cut him off before he could retreat behind another excuse. "If Olivia remembered everything, cooked better, loved your family more, understood your ambitions, and somehow did every single thing better than I ever could." I held his gaze without raising my voice. "Then maybe she's the woman you were supposed to marry." The color slowly drained from his face. "Natalie, I was only joking." "Were you?" "Of course." I gave a small, tired smile. "You've been telling that same joke for 6 years." He opened his mouth, but no answer came. The silence told me everything I needed to know. I gathered my plate, carried it into the kitchen, and scraped the untouched pasta into the trash. Behind me, I heard his chair scrape sharply across the floor. "Natalie, wait!" I turned. For the first time all evening, he actually looked frightened. "I didn't mean it like that." "I know." He frowned. "You do?" "Yes," I said quietly. "You never mean it. You just keep saying it." That answer seemed to unsettle him even more. I smiled, not because I was happy, but because an unexpected calm had settled over me. The anger I'd carried for years had simply disappeared. "Lucky for you," I said, "I can fix that mistake." His forehead creased. "What does that mean?" "It means you don't have to spend the rest of your life settling for someone who disappoints you." I walked past him before he could stop me, went into my home office, and closed the door behind me. Everything inside looked exactly as I'd left it 8 months earlier. I opened the top drawer, took out the attorney's business card, and placed it beside my keyboard. Then I opened my email and typed a single sentence. "I'd like to move forward with filing for divorce. Please let me know your earliest availability." I read it once, took the slow breath, and clicked send. Outside the office, I could hear Ethan pacing back and forth through the hallway. Normally, that would have filled me with guilt. Instead, I leaned back in my chair and realized something had finally changed. I no longer wondered whether I'd gone too far. I knew I hadn't. Sleep didn't come easily that night, but it wasn't because I regretted my decision. It was because I understood there was no going back. Sometime after midnight, the bedroom door opened. I kept my eyes closed while Ethan stood beside the bed for nearly a minute. I could feel him watching me, as if he were waiting for me to wake up and tell him everything would be fine. Normally, he would have apologized, wrapped an arm around me, and hoped we'd both pretend the argument had never happened. Instead, he let out a long sigh, climbed into bed without saying a word, and stayed on his side of the mattress. We lay only a few feet apart, yet the distance between us had never felt greater. The next morning, I was already dressed when he shuffled into the kitchen. "Natalie," I looked up from my coffee. "We should talk." "I agree." Relief crossed his face so quickly it was almost painful to watch. "We should talk about the divorce process tonight." His expression collapsed. What?" "I'll be home around 6. "Natalie, seriously." I picked up my keys. "I'm running late for work." "You can't actually be serious." I opened the front door. "You'll have your answer tonight." Then I left. At 10:07 that morning, my phone buzzed. "Ethan, about last night. I think we need to talk." I replied. "Me, I agree. We should discuss how to handle the divorce." The typing bubble appeared instantly, disappeared, then returned again before my phone started ringing. I declined the first call. When he called again, then a third time, I muted my phone instead of watching the screen light up over and over. A text followed. "Ethan, please answer." "Me, I'm working." Within a minute, my phone was overflowing with notifications. I skimmed the first few before muting the conversation. "You're overreacting." "I didn't mean it." "You're blowing one comment way out of proportion." "We've had arguments before." "Don't throw away 8 years over something this stupid." One comment. I couldn't help laughing. He still believed this had started with dinner. He couldn't see the thousands of tiny moments that had come before it, each one shaving away another piece of my confidence until I no longer recognized the woman looking back at me in the mirror. At lunch, I drove straight to my attorney's office. He recognized me the moment I walked in. "I wondered when I'd hear from you again." So did I. Once we were seated, he asked the only question that mattered. "You've made your decision?" "I have." He nodded and opened my file. "Then let's go through what happens next." For nearly an hour, we reviewed every practical detail. Our state's mandatory waiting period, the jointly owned house, retirement accounts, savings, vehicles, and everything else people rarely think about while planning a wedding. Fortunately, Ethan and I had always kept our finances mostly separate. We each had our own accounts, although I earned about 40% more than he did, so I'd always covered a larger share of the mortgage and household expenses. The house had appreciated enough that selling it would leave us both with a reasonable amount of equity. "I want this to stay fair," I told him. "I'm not trying to punish Ethan. I just want a clean ending." "That's usually the healthiest approach," he said. As we wrapped up, he paused before closing the folder. "One piece of advice." "I'm listening." "Don't move out." I wasn't planning to. "Good. Staying in the home often avoids unnecessary legal complications during separation." "I understand." Walking out of his office, I felt relieved for the first time in months. When I arrived home that evening, Ethan was already there. The kitchen had been cleaned, the dishes from the night before were gone, candles flickered in the center of the dining table, and a fresh bouquet of flowers sat beside them. The candles and flowers looked less like an apology and more like a desperate attempt to erase the last 24 hours. Ethan stood the moment I stepped inside. His eyes were bloodshot, his face drawn with exhaustion. Whether he'd spent the night crying or simply hadn't slept, I couldn't tell. "Natalie!" I set my purse on the table and waited. "I'm sorry." He took a cautious step toward me. "I know I compare you to Olivia sometimes." I couldn't help raising an eyebrow. "Sometimes?" He closed his eyes for a second. "Okay, more than sometimes." "But it doesn't mean anything." He searched for an explanation that sounded believable. "It's just venting. Everyone complains about their spouse." "No," I said quietly. "They don't." His brow furrowed. "Of course they do. I've never compared you to a single man I've dated. He stared at me, speechless. Not once in 8 years. Do you know why? He said nothing. Because I chose you. The moment I married you, my past stopped being the standard you had to compete with. His eyes began to fill. I never wanted you to feel like you were second place. But I did. The words came out calmly, which somehow made them hit harder. Almost every week. He instinctively reached for my hand, but I stepped back before he could touch me. His arm lingered awkwardly in the air before dropping to his side. So that's it? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. You're ending everything over one fight? I shook my head. This stopped being about one fight years ago. I held his gaze, determined that he would finally hear everything he'd spent so long dismissing. This is 6 years of hearing another woman's name every time I disappointed you. 6 years of wondering why you married me if I could never measure up. 6 years of telling you those comparisons hurt, only to be told I was too sensitive or taking things too personally. Tears slipped down his face. I love you. I believe you think you do. Confusion replaced the panic in his expression. What does that mean? It means love isn't supposed to leave your partner feeling inadequate every day. The room fell quiet. Ethan looked away first, rubbing both hands across his face before speaking again. What do I do now? You cooperate. He frowned. What? I've already retained a divorce attorney. His head snapped up. You what? The paperwork has already started. Natalie, please. No, you don't understand. I understand perfectly. He shook his head, desperation creeping into every word. I'll stop comparing you. I'll never mention Olivia again, I swear. I studied him for a long moment before asking the only question that mattered. If I hadn't finally snapped last night, would you have stopped on your own? He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. He didn't answer because he couldn't. The truth was sitting between us. Impossible to ignore. Without that dinner, without that final comparison, tomorrow would have looked exactly like yesterday. Another careless remark, another apology, another promise. Then the cycle would have started all over again. His silence answered the question far better than words ever could. I picked up my bag. I'm sleeping in the guest room tonight. Natalie. I stopped at the hallway and looked back one last time. We can handle this respectfully, or we can make it expensive. The choice is yours. I closed the guest room door behind me. A few seconds later, I heard a chair scrape across the floor, followed by the dull sound of Ethan dropping into it. He finally understood I wasn't trying to frighten him into changing. I'd already made my decision. 5 days later, everything unfolded almost exactly the way my attorney had predicted. Ethan never accepted that the decision belonged to both of us. In his mind, divorce wasn't real unless he agreed to it. His first instinct wasn't to book a therapy session or spend a single minute asking himself how we'd ended up here. He called his mother. Less than 2 hours later, my doorbell rang. When I opened the door, Patricia Brooks stood on my porch with Ethan a step behind her. His eyes were swollen from lack of sleep, but his mother's expression carried nothing except anger. She didn't bother with a greeting. So this is how you repay my son after everything he's done for you? I'm sorry? Don't act confused. Ethan told me you're throwing away your marriage over one argument. I looked past her. You told her that's what happened? Ethan shifted awkwardly but avoided my eyes. Patricia didn't give him the chance to answer. My son has loved you for 8 years. Every marriage has rough patches. Mature adults don't walk away because someone's feelings got hurt. I'm not walking away because of one argument, I said evenly. I'm ending a marriage that's been falling apart for years. It isn't falling apart, Ethan cut in. I never agreed to this. You don't have to. He frowned. What does that mean? It means divorce doesn't require mutual approval. One person files, the other responds. Patricia folded her arms. I never imagined you'd become this selfish. I almost laughed. Selfish? My son sacrificed so much for you. He supported your career, stood by you through stressful years, and this is how you thank him? You're leaving because he made a few careless comments? She kept talking, waiting for me to defend myself. I didn't. When she finally ran out of words, I asked quietly, Are you finished? She blinked. What? I asked if you're finished. Her expression hardened. I have work to do, I said. You can leave now. Neither of them moved. It quickly became obvious. Patricia wasn't interested in solving anything. She wanted an argument, and she clearly wasn't used to someone refusing to give her one. After a long stare, she shook her head. You're making the biggest mistake of your life. Maybe, I replied as I opened the door a little wider, but it's still my mistake to make. Instead of leaving, she brushed past me and walked straight into the living room as though she owned the place. Ethan quietly followed her. For nearly 3 hours, I worked behind the closed door of my office while I listened to muffled conversations drifting through the hallway. I never joined them. Eventually, the front door slammed shut. When I finally stepped outside, the house was silent. Later that evening, I noticed Ethan's suitcase was gone. He'd gone back to his parents' house. The quiet that followed felt unfamiliar. I cooked dinner, seasoned it exactly the way I liked, and ate without hearing Olivia's name once. It was amazing how peaceful a house could feel when nobody was measuring you against someone who wasn't even there. The peace lasted less than a day. The next morning, my phone started filling with messages. One of Ethan's college friends wrote, I can't believe you'd leave him like this. An hour later, a mutual friend asked if I was okay because Ethan had told everyone I was acting completely different. By lunchtime, even one of my cousins had called to ask whether I was having some kind of emotional breakdown. That was when I realized Ethan had already started rewriting our marriage for everyone else. According to his version of events, we'd been perfectly happy until I suddenly snapped without warning. There was no mention of 6 years of comparisons, no mention of Olivia, and certainly no mention of how many times I'd begged him to stop. In his story, he was the devoted husband desperately trying to save his marriage, while I was the unstable wife walking away for no reason. One message finally pushed me to respond. A mutual friend wrote, "Ethan always said you were the love of his life. I don't understand why you'd hurt him like this." I took a screenshot before replying. Ask him how many times he told me Olivia would have handled things better before deciding who's been hurting whom. The typing bubble appeared for a few seconds. Then it disappeared. No reply ever came. Apparently, the missing half of the story changed everything. A few days later, another problem surfaced. The mortgage company called while I was at work. The representative explained that someone had contacted them several times asking whether one homeowner could refinance or assume the mortgage without the other's consent if the marriage was becoming unstable. I already knew who had made those calls before she confirmed it. Ethan. We hadn't even sat down with our attorneys yet, and he was already trying to figure out how to keep the house. As soon as the call ended, I contacted my attorney. He wasn't surprised. "It happens more often than you'd think," he said. "Document everything, and whatever you do, don't move out." I wasn't planning to. Good. Leaving voluntarily can create unnecessary complications later. That evening, Patricia called me herself. "I think it's time we talked like adults." "I'm listening." "My son made mistakes," she admitted. "I'm not pretending he didn't." I stayed quiet. "But you're throwing away a good marriage over wounded pride." I closed my eyes for a moment before answering. "You weren't married to him." "I know my son." "No," I said gently. "You know the version of him he chooses to show you." She sighed heavily. "He loves you." "Does he?" She hesitated. "For 6 years, I've listened to him compare me to another woman. I've spent those same 6 years wondering why he married me if she was everything he actually wanted. Every time I told him those comparisons hurt, he brushed it off and told me I was too sensitive." She had no answer. Finally, she whispered, "He's been under a lot of stress." "So have I." "He's insecure." "So was I." "The difference is that I never used another man to make him feel smaller." I heard her begin to cry. "Please, just give him one more chance. He'll go to counseling. He'll change." "I genuinely hope he does," I said honestly. "I hope he becomes a better man someday, but he needs to do that for himself, not because he's trying to save a marriage he spent years damaging." I ended the call. About an hour later, an anonymous text arrived. It contained only a screenshot. The photo showed Ethan standing beside Olivia at someone's wedding 3 years earlier. They were smiling, standing much closer than old acquaintances usually would, and the caption beneath the picture read, "Some connections never really fade." A knot formed in my stomach. Ethan had never told me he'd seen Olivia again. Not once. The anonymous sender added one final line beneath the screenshot. "Thought you deserved to know they've stayed in touch a lot longer than he admitted." I stared at my phone for a long time before saving the image. Deep down, I already knew this wasn't the end of the story. 12 days after telling Ethan I wanted a divorce, I stopped questioning whether I was making the right decision. Instead, I found myself wondering why I'd stayed as long as I had. The screenshot kept replaying in my head, not just the photo itself, but the caption beneath it. Some connections never really fade. If Ethan had run into Olivia once by chance, he would have told me. After 8 years together, there shouldn't have been surprises like that. So I did something I'd never imagined I'd need to do. I wasn't snooping through passwords or breaking into private accounts. I simply opened folders we'd both had access to for years, but almost never used. Our shared cloud storage, old photo backups, and albums that had automatically synced from our phones. At first, I found nothing unusual. The folders were filled with ordinary things: vacation photos, family dinners, receipts, and random screenshots. Then I opened a folder from 3 summers earlier. Inside was a photo I had never seen before. Ethan and Olivia were sitting across from each other at an outdoor cafe, smiling as though no time had passed between them. The timestamp caught my attention immediately. That was the same week he'd told me he'd been working late every night. I kept scrolling. Another picture showed them at a concert he'd claimed was a networking event while I was away at a conference. Then came another coffee shop, another dinner, another meeting. By the time I finished, I'd counted 4 separate occasions over 3 years that he'd never mentioned. I wasn't looking at one bad decision anymore. I was looking at a 3-year pattern. The archived message backups told the same story. Most of the conversations had been deleted, but fragments survived in old notification previews. "I miss talking to you. Nobody understands me the way you do. Sometimes I wonder what life would have looked like if things had been different." None of it proved a physical affair. It didn't need to. He had maintained an emotional relationship behind my back while repeatedly telling me I was insecure for questioning why he couldn't let go of his ex. I saved screenshots of everything and forwarded them to my attorney. He called a few hours later. "This matters." "You think so too?" "I do. It supports what you've been telling me from the beginning. None of this was in your head." "I wish it had been." So do I. Later that afternoon, Ethan texted, "Can I come by tonight? I need to pick up some clothes." I replied with a single word, "Fine." He arrived exactly at 7. The moment I opened the door, I could tell he hadn't been taking care of himself. His beard had grown in, his eyes were swollen, and the 2 empty duffel bags hanging from his shoulders looked heavier than they should have. "I'll be quick," he said. I stepped aside without answering. He went upstairs, and for several minutes, all I heard were drawers opening and closing. When he came back down, he left the bags by the front door instead of picking them up. "Natalie!" I folded my arms and waited. "I've been thinking." I didn't respond. "I know I messed up." He swallowed hard. "I know I hurt you." "Still nothing. I found a couples therapist. They can see us next week." "Ethan, please just hear me out." He took a cautious step toward me. "Give me 3 months. That's all I'm asking. We'll go every week, and I'll prove I can change." I looked at him for a moment before asking the question I'd been carrying around all day. "How many times did you meet Olivia?" Every trace of color disappeared from his face. "What? How many times?" You should answer carefully." His breathing grew noticeably faster. "What are you talking about?" "I know about the dinners," I said quietly. "The coffee meetings. The concert. I know a lot more than you think." For several seconds, he simply stared at me. Finally, he asked, "You went through my things?" I looked through our shared cloud storage. His expression crumpled. "I never thought I'd have to." He slowly lowered himself onto the edge of a chair, looking as though his legs had given out. "Natalie, it wasn't like that." "What exactly wasn't?" "We were just catching up." "For 3 years?" He covered his face with both hands. "It was never physical." "I don't care." He looked up confused. "What?" "I don't care whether you kissed her. You hid an ongoing relationship from your wife, spent years comparing me to her, and kept meeting her behind my back. Whether you crossed a physical line stopped mattering a long time ago." His voice broke. I was confused. "No." I shook my head. "You weren't confused. You were dishonest. I never wanted to leave you, but you wanted to keep her in your life." That time, he didn't even try to argue. The silence hanging between us was heavier than any fight we'd ever had, because we both knew there wasn't a single explanation left that could undo what I'd found. Finally, he looked down and said so quietly I almost missed it, "I'm sorry." For the first time in years, I believed he meant those words. The problem was that sincerity had arrived far too late. "I'm sorry isn't enough anymore," I said. He nodded faintly, picked up his bags, and walked toward the front door. His hand rested on the doorknob for a moment before he turned back. "Is there really nothing I can do?" I met his eyes. "You had 6 years." He lowered his head, accepted the answer without another argument, and walked out. 2 days later, I learned that accepting the divorce wasn't part of his family's plan. Around 10 that morning, my manager stopped beside my desk. "Natalie, there's a woman in the lobby asking for you." "Who is it?" He hesitated. "She says she's your mother-in-law. Apparently it's a family emergency." I already knew it wasn't. When I reached the lobby, Patricia was pacing near reception. The moment she spotted me, she strode across the room before I had a chance to speak. "You need to stop this." I lowered my voice, hoping she would do the same. "This isn't the place." "Then agree to meet with Ethan." "No. You're humiliating my son." Several coworkers were pretending to focus on their computers while clearly listening to every word. "You're the one creating a scene," I said. "This is my workplace." "I don't care." "I do. If you don't leave voluntarily, I'll ask security to escort you out." She stared at me in disbelief. "You'd call security on family?" "I'd call security on anyone who refuses to respect basic boundaries." Her jaw tightened. "You're going to regret this." I didn't raise my voice. "The only thing I regret is waiting 6 years to stand up for myself." She glared at me for another second, then turned sharply and stormed out of the building. Once she was gone, my manager walked over. "You okay?" "I'm going through a difficult divorce." He nodded sympathetically. "If she comes back, let me know right away." "I will." That evening, I documented the entire incident, including the time, the witnesses, and exactly what had been said, then emailed everything to my attorney. He replied less than 20 minutes later. "Keep documenting every interaction. A pattern like this can become important." At the time, I didn't realize how right he was, because the next person to contact me wasn't Ethan. It wasn't Patricia. It was Olivia. Her message arrived a little after 8 that evening. I almost deleted it without opening it. Then I saw the sender's name, Olivia Grant. For a moment, I wondered whether it was a fake account, but one quick look at the profile answered that question. Years of photos, mutual friends, and ordinary posts made it clear it was really her. The message itself was surprisingly direct. "Hi, Natalie. I heard through mutual friends that you and Ethan are getting divorced. I debated whether I should reach out, but I think you deserve to know the truth." I stared at the screen for a few seconds before replying. "What truth?" The typing indicator appeared almost immediately. "Nothing physical ever happened between Ethan and me while you were married." I kept reading. "We met for coffee a few times, had dinner once, and went to a concert with mutual friends. Looking back, I should have stopped agreeing to meet him much sooner. I kept convincing myself we were just old friends catching up, but I realize now that it crossed a line. I'm sorry." That last sentence mattered. For the first time, someone besides me was willing to admit a mistake. I felt neither relieved nor angry. Mostly I was exhausted. Another message arrived. "He talked about you a lot." I typed back. "What did he say?" Her answer came almost instantly. "Mostly complaints." That hurt more than I expected. For years, I'd listened to Ethan praise Olivia as though she were the standard I could never reach. Now I was learning he'd spent those same years criticizing me to the very woman he'd been comparing me against. Olivia sent another message. Honestly, I always wondered why he stayed married if he was that unhappy. I leaned back on the couch, reading the words over before asking the question that mattered most. Did he ever tell you he compared me to you all the time? This time she didn't answer right away. When the reply finally appeared, it was painfully simple. Yes. A second message followed almost immediately. He said he was trying to motivate you. I let out a slow breath. Motivate me. I almost laughed. After everything that had happened, that was still the word he'd chosen. Olivia continued typing. I told him more than once that it was cruel. Nobody wants to spend a marriage competing with someone from the past. I warned him it would eventually destroy your relationship. A few seconds later, she sent one final message. He didn't listen. I read those words several times, not because they surprised me, because hearing them from the woman Ethan had spent years holding above me erased the last bit of doubt I'd been carrying. There was nothing left to question anymore. For a long time, I'd convinced myself the problem might actually be me. I'd spent years wondering whether I was too sensitive, overreacting, or simply too insecure to handle the truth. Olivia's messages erased those doubts in a matter of minutes. If even she had recognized Ethan's behavior as unhealthy, then I hadn't imagined any of it. I thanked her for being honest. She apologized once more for not cutting contact sooner, and the conversation ended there. I sat quietly for a few minutes before saving screenshots of the entire exchange and forwarding them to my attorney. Then, after thinking it over, I did something I normally never would have done. I sent the screenshots exactly as they were. No message, no accusation. I wanted the conversation to speak for itself. My phone rang less than 30 seconds later. I declined the call. He called again, then again. By the 10th attempt, I muted my phone and turned it face down on the coffee table. Eventually, the calls stopped, replaced by a voicemail notification. I almost deleted it without listening, but curiosity won. Ethan? His voice was shaking. Natalie, please, why would she contact you? He took a shaky breath before continuing. She had no right to tell you those things. I know I messed up. I know, but now you're turning everyone against me. This isn't fair. The recording ended with him crying softly. I deleted it, not out of anger, but because there was nothing left to say. The next morning, I met my attorney again. He carefully reviewed every new piece of evidence, the screenshots from Olivia, the anonymous wedding photo, the documentation from Patricia's visit to my workplace, and the timeline we'd been building since the beginning. When he closed the file, he looked up and said, I think we're ready. I agree. He slid the final paperwork across the desk. I read every page carefully. Nothing had changed from what we'd discussed. The house, our retirement accounts, our savings, and the legal timeline were all exactly as expected. When I reached the signature line, I signed without hesitation. He gathered the documents. I'll file everything this afternoon. Thank you. As I stood to leave, he smiled. You seem calmer than the last time you were here. I am. What changed? I thought about it for a moment. For 6 years, I kept wondering if I was imagining things, I said. Now I know I wasn't. That afternoon, Ethan was officially served with the divorce papers. By the end of the afternoon, he'd called 16 times and filled my phone with messages, but nothing he said changed my mind. By then, the marriage had already ended emotionally. The paperwork was only making it official. 3 weeks later, everything was moving almost exactly as my attorney had predicted. The divorce still had to go through the mandatory waiting period, but the negotiations were finished. The paperwork had been filed, and the house was officially on the market. Neither of us fought over the proceeds. We agreed to split the equity equally, keep our own retirement accounts, savings, and vehicles, and walk away without seeking alimony. Between legal fees and a cooling housing market, neither of us would leave with as much as we'd once expected. Divorce rarely leaves anyone feeling like they won. Even so, I walked away with something far more valuable than money or property. Ethan's attempt to control the narrative also unraveled much faster than he'd expected. Over the next few days, several friends reached out. Some apologized for believing Ethan's version of events, while others admitted they had no idea what had really been happening behind closed doors. I thanked each of them and moved on. I wasn't interested in proving Ethan was a terrible person. I only wanted the truth to exist somewhere besides my own memory. A few days later, I received another unexpected message. It came from Ethan's father. Unlike Patricia, he'd always been calm and reasonable. We weren't especially close, but we'd always treated each other with respect. His text was brief. Natalie, I'm sorry for what happened at your workplace. Patricia crossed a line, and I've made that very clear. Ethan finally admitted the truth about meeting Olivia. He has a lot of growing up to do. I sincerely wish you the best moving forward. I thanked him. There wasn't much else either of us needed to say. Not long afterward, another piece of news made its way through mutual friends. Word of Ethan's secret meetings with Olivia had spread farther than either of them expected, eventually reaching Olivia's longtime boyfriend. They'd been together for nearly 4 years, and once he learned about the coffees, dinners, and concert she'd never told him about, he ended the relationship. I didn't celebrate hearing that. Mostly, I felt sad that two relationships had been damaged by choices that should never have been made in the first place. Then came the final twist. Once Olivia became single, Ethan convinced himself the divorce and her breakup were fate giving them another chance. Instead of apologizing or asking for closure, he asked if they could finally be together. According to a mutual friend, Olivia didn't hesitate. She told him she'd moved on years earlier and that the version of their relationship he'd been chasing existed only in his memories. They'd shared 2 good years in college, but they weren't those people anymore. Then she said something that stayed with me long after I heard it. Watching the way he'd treated me had changed how she saw him. Constantly comparing one partner to another wasn't motivation, honesty, or love. It was simply cruel. She reminded him that she'd warned him more than once he was destroying his own marriage, and she had no interest in building a future with someone who treated his wife that way. For 6 years, Ethan had convinced himself Olivia was the perfect woman I'd never be. When he finally had the chance to choose her again, she didn't choose him. That wasn't satisfying because he was suffering. It was satisfying because reality had finally caught up with the fantasy. While waiting for this house to sell, I rented a modest apartment with a small kitchen, a bedroom overlooking a parking lot, and barely any extra space. I loved every inch of it because it immediately felt like home. Everything inside that apartment belonged to me. For the first time in years, I lived in a place where nothing reminded me that I was being compared to someone else. About a month after moving in, I started seeing a therapist. It wasn't because I couldn't get through the day. It was because 6 years of being told someone else would have been a better wife leaves marks you don't notice until the voice saying it finally disappears. During one session, she asked a question that caught me completely off guard. When was the last time you felt comfortable just being yourself? I opened my mouth to answer, but nothing came. The longer I sat there, the more I realized I genuinely couldn't remember. Recovery wasn't dramatic the way I'd imagined it would be. There wasn't one life-changing moment where everything suddenly felt better. Instead, it crept in quietly through ordinary routines. I could cook dinner without wondering how someone else would have done it, wander through a grocery store without comparing myself to another woman, and make everyday decisions without worrying they'd somehow disappoint the person sitting across from me. One afternoon, my older sister stopped by with takeout. After we'd finished eating, she looked around my apartment for a moment before smiling. "I haven't seen you this relaxed in years." I laughed. "Really?" She nodded. "I didn't know how to tell you this before, but you slowly disappeared during that marriage." I frowned. "What do you mean?" "Somewhere along the way, you stopped sounding like yourself. You laughed less, apologized constantly, and questioned every decision you made." She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "I'm proud of you for choosing yourself." Her words stayed with me long after she left because they were true. I'd spent years trying to become the woman Ethan wished he'd married, instead of appreciating the woman I'd always been. Last night, I made pasta using the exact same recipe, the same homemade sauce, and the same seasoning I'd been using all along. I sat alone at my kitchen table, took a bite, and smiled. It tasted exactly the way I remembered. That's when it finally hit me. There had never been anything wrong with the recipe. I'd simply spent 6 years serving it to the wrong person.